My name isn't Elizabeth, at least not the name he knew. The world called me his wife, the woman who stood beside a man everyone admired. He was the Alexander Vale, the CEO, with a smile that built empires and a gaze that made people believe he never lied. But I knew better, because while the world saw his perfection, I was the one who built it for him, brick by brick, lie by lie. When people ask how I managed to destroy a man like him without ever lifting a hand, I tell them the truth. I simply gave him what he gave me, an illusion. Only mine was sharper, colder, and permanent. It began with a name, Elizabeth Rain, a woman who never existed until I wrote her into the story of his life. He thought he chose me because I was different, because I understood power. He never realized I studied him long before he noticed me. Every secret, every weakness, every number in his perfect little world. I memorized them all. So when I walked into his company that morning, wearing the white blouse he'd later call fate, I already knew how it would end. He saw beauty. I saw opportunity. He saw trust. I saw revenge waiting for a reason. People always think revenge begins with anger. Mine began with silence. Because silence lets you listen. And when you listen long enough, you hear exactly where to place the knife. Sometimes, I wonder if he ever realized how early I started digging his grave. When he handed me that first coffee and smiled, I was already counting the days until he'd lose everything. They call me a monster. Maybe I am. But monsters are born in darkness, and he was the one who turned off the light. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever loved someone who lied to your face while swearing they'd die for you, let me tell you a story. The story of how a man built his empire on deception and how the woman he thought he owned burned it to the ground, one secret at a time. Because my name isn't Elizabeth. It's the name he whispered before he fell. And tonight, I'll tell you exactly how I made him fall. He once said that every empire begins with a dream, but his began with a lie, and mine began with his. The first time I saw Alexander Vale, it wasn't at a gala or a boardroom, but on the cover of a magazine. His face, sharp, composed, perfectly lit, carried the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Visionary, CEO, expands global reach. That was the headline. And I remember tracing his photo with my finger, whispering the words I didn't yet understand. You'll learn to look at me like that too. It sounds obsessive, doesn't it? But revenge always starts with fascination. You study the enemy so well, you forget you're supposed to hate them. At least for a while. When I joined Vale Industries, I was nobody. A name on a resume. A fabricated background, degrees, experience, clean history. Every detail carefully built over 3 years of planning. Elizabeth Rain, educated in London, worked briefly in Singapore. No family, no scandals, no roots. A perfect ghost. He noticed me on my second week. He was walking past the analytics department, talking fast, surrounded by men who looked terrified to breathe without permission. I remember the sound of his voice, low, precise, cutting through the air like it owned it. He stopped when he saw me. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. He asked my name. I told him. And just like that, Elizabeth Rain became real. He smiled, that practiced, charming, lethal smile, and said, "You have the kind of focus people write about." I wanted to laugh. If he only knew what that focus was aimed at. I worked my way closer, quietly. People rise through talent or manipulation. I used both. I learned his habits, the way he reviewed reports at 6:45 a.m., how he always double-checked signatures himself, how he only trusted numbers, never people. That was my entry point. Within months, I became indispensable. He called me his shadow, said he didn't make a decision without me. I smiled and nodded, pretending not to notice that his shadow was already moving ahead of him. I listened to him talk about his past, about the father who abandoned him, the mother who died too early, the mentors who betrayed him. And I realized he wasn't a man. He was a wound wearing a suit. And wounds are easy to reopen. When he finally asked me to dinner, I said yes. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. He thought it was the beginning of love, but it was the beginning of ruin. He told me about his dreams, the merger, the expansion, the empire he wanted to leave behind. I listened, smiled, encouraged. I memorized every secret he didn't mean to share. And when he reached across the table, touched my hand, and said, "I don't know why, but I feel like I can trust you," I wanted to say, "You shouldn't." But I didn't. I just smiled. Because lies sound truer when spoken softly. That night, he drove me home, and I watched the city lights blur outside the car window. Each light reminded me of something I'd buried: pain, betrayal, humiliation, everything that led me here. He didn't know it, but he was sitting beside the ghost of every person who had ever broken me. He thought he was falling in love, but I was already falling into position. And so began our story. A man who thought he'd found his forever, and a woman who was never meant to stay. He built the illusion of perfection. I built the illusion of Elizabeth. And when two illusions meet, one of them must disappear. They say you can't lie forever. But that's not true. You can, if you become the lie. Months turned into a year, and my name, Elizabeth Rain, began to feel like skin I could no longer remove. I lived in his world now, the world of glass offices, champagne smiles, and sharp whispers behind closed doors. Every woman envied me. Every man admired him. And every morning, I woke up beside a man who loved a ghost. At first, I thought I could control it, the illusion, the emotions, the growing weight of pretending. But love, even when it's false, is dangerous. Because sometimes, when someone looks at you like you're the only truth they've ever seen, you start to wish you were. He gave me everything, or so it seemed. The penthouse, the cars, the dinners in cities that look like dreams. He said I was his calm in a chaotic world. But calm is only the surface of deep, violent waters. And I knew, sooner or later, something would break the surface. It started with a name, someone from my fabricated past, a former colleague from Singapore, that never existed. A man from Alexander's team wanted to verify a reference. Just a routine check, he said. I smiled, kept my voice steady, and offered to provide new documents. But that night, I didn't sleep. Because I realized how fragile my empire was. One email, one call, one mistake, and Elizabeth Rain would vanish. He noticed. He always noticed. "Something's bothering you," he said. I told him it was nothing. He kissed my forehead and promised I'd never have to worry again. I wanted to laugh. He had no idea that I was the worry. A few weeks later, the mask began to crack, not mine, but his. It started small. A late-night call he didn't answer. A trip to New York that ended a day later than scheduled. And then, the messages. I saw them by accident, or maybe it wasn't an accident at all. His phone, left unlocked, open on the counter. Her name, Clara. A journalist, young, beautiful, curious about the man behind the empire. Their messages were polite at first, but words have a way of slipping into temptation. Soon, the compliments turned to confessions. She said she admired him. He said she made him feel alive again. Alive, as if my presence were death itself. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I turned it off, placed it exactly where he left it, and smiled. Because for the first time, I wasn't angry. I was free. Betrayal does something to the mind. It kills the part that pleads and awakens the part that plans. And in that quiet, hollow ache where heartbreak should be, revenge is born. He didn't know I knew. He kept playing his role, the devoted husband, the visionary, the man adored by millions. But I started watching differently. Every movement, every word, every careless detail. And beneath that perfect exterior, I found something even darker than his betrayal. Offshore accounts, false reports, investments that didn't exist. Alexander Vale wasn't just unfaithful, he was corrupt. He wasn't building an empire, he was laundering it. And that's when I understood the real lie in our marriage. He never loved me for who I was. He loved me because I could hide things better than anyone else. He chose me because I was a mask that fit his mask perfectly. I remember the night I confronted the mirror. I stared at my reflection, perfect hair, diamond earrings, flawless skin, and whispered, "Who are you now?" The mirror didn't answer, but I did. I'm the woman he'll regret meeting. After that, I stopped pretending. I smiled more. I listened more. And I began collecting everything that could destroy him. Quietly, carefully, without mercy. Every signature he asked me to notarize. Every transaction he told me to forget. Every conversation that started with, "This stays between us." It all went into a file, hidden, encrypted, waiting. He thought I was still his shadow, but by then I had already stepped out of his light. He betrayed me once, but I was about to betray him forever. They say there's a moment when heartbreak transforms into something else. It doesn't heal. It hardens. For me, it happened on a Thursday night. He was in New York again. Another meeting, I was alone in the penthouse, the city lights reflecting off the glass like scattered stars. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop. Not for work, for truth. I started tracing his digital footprints, company files, shell accounts, encrypted folders hidden beneath layers of security. But Alexander taught me well. And if there's one thing he respected in me, it was my ability to think like him. 3 hours in, I found it. A folder buried in the company archives, labeled Legacy Projects. Inside were documents connecting his clean empire to something rotten, a charity that never existed, a foundation that funneled millions into private accounts. And the signatures were all his. I sat there staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to cry. The other part smiled, because now I had him. But this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It wasn't about the woman named Clara or the lies he told in bed. It was about justice, and justice takes patience. For weeks, I lived as if nothing had changed. I laughed at his jokes. I attended his meetings. I kissed him goodnight and whispered that I loved him. He never saw the difference, because narcissists never look for truth when the lie flatters them. At night, I collected proof, every illegal deal, every falsified report, every transfer that tied his name to a web of deceit. Piece by piece, I built a new empire, one made of evidence, not emotion. And then, fate intervened. He brought her to one of our charity galas. Clara, the journalist, his secret fascination now introduced as a media consultant. The irony almost made me laugh. I watched them across the room, her in a red dress, him with that same practiced smile. He looked untouchable, but so did I. He didn't notice the slight change in my expression when I raised my glass toward him. He thought it was admiration. It was farewell. That night, after the guests left, he tried to explain. Said she was just helping with PR. Said I had nothing to worry about. I nodded. And while he spoke, I pressed record on my phone, his voice confessing to the very connections I'd been gathering proof of. He didn't know that every word he said became another nail in his empire's coffin. After that, everything became simple. I created a trail, one that led investigators exactly where I wanted them to look. I made anonymous reports. I sent encrypted files to a trusted contact in finance regulation. And all the while, I stayed beside him, smiling, quiet, unshaken. Sometimes he'd look at me and say, "Elizabeth, you make me feel safe." And I'd answer softly, "That's because you still believe in me." He didn't realize I had already begun dismantling his life. Each day felt like walking through fire and not burning. Each night I'd look at him sleeping, the man who once made me feel seen, now blind to the storm forming right beside him. And when the first headlines appeared, Vale Industries under investigation for financial misconduct, he froze. He called his lawyers, shouted, paced, broke a glass against the wall, and I just watched, silent, composed. Because chaos was the only music I wanted to hear. He never suspected me. How could he? In his mind, Elizabeth Rain was loyal, obedient, devoted, the perfect wife, the perfect illusion. But in truth, I was the author of his downfall. He built his world on deceit. I simply mirrored it back until it consumed him. That night, as he stared at the city lights, muttering about betrayal, about trust, I whispered to myself, "It's almost over." And for the first time in years, I said my real name, quietly, to the dark. Because soon, Elizabeth Rain would vanish, and the woman beneath would finally be free. Revenge isn't loud, it doesn't scream or rage or bleed. Real revenge is quiet. It walks slowly, almost gently, and removes things one by one until the world you knew no longer exists. That's how I ended him. After the headlines faded, and his lawyers scrambled to contain the rumors, I disappeared, not physically, but from his reach. I moved through the days like a shadow, calm, invisible, efficient. He thought the storm had passed. He didn't know it was only the beginning. Alexander Vale believed he could rebuild. He still had connections, investors, influence. He told himself he would rise again. He always did. That's what men like him believe, that failure is just another stage of dominance. But what he didn't realize was that the foundation beneath him was already hollow. Because I had made it so. I started with his trust. Every person he relied on, every assistant, consultant, associate, I quietly redirected. Emails that never reached their destination. Documents that arrived late. Rumors planted with surgical precision. No evidence, no trace. Just the subtle erosion of confidence. Then I moved to his investors. Anonymous tips, whispers of instability, quiet doubts about leadership. Markets don't need proof. They only need fear. And fear spreads faster than truth. His empire began to crumble from the inside, Stockholders withdrew, partners renegotiated, projects stalled. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed me, too, of course. But even his suspicion came too late, because by the time he started asking questions, I had already erased myself. Elizabeth Rain, his perfect wife, his confidant, vanished like mist. The accounts he'd hidden under offshore names, frozen. His personal funds, tied to investigations. His reputation, untouched in the public eye, but poisoned among those who mattered most. He was still Alexander Vale, publicly brilliant, privately bankrupt. And I watched from a distance as he tried to fix it. He sold assets, begged for loyalty, reached out to people who once worshipped him. No one answered. It wasn't malice. It was silence, the kind that kills faster than hate. He started showing up to the office later, then not at all. His penthouse lights stayed off for days. The press lost interest. The empire he built simply dissolved. One night, months later, I saw him again, from afar. He was standing by the water, looking out at the city that used to bow to him. His reflection, smaller, fragile, human. He looked nothing like the man who once thought he owned the world. And I felt nothing. No triumph, no joy, no satisfaction, just completion. Because revenge isn't about feeling better. It's about ending a story on your own terms. By then I had already erased Elizabeth, deleted her records, closed her accounts, burned every trace of the woman who never existed. He spent the rest of his days trying to find me. Not to apologize, but to understand. He never did. Because you can't find someone who was never real. In the end, he wasn't destroyed by scandal or justice or revenge. He was destroyed by doubt. The quiet thought that maybe everything he'd built, everything he'd loved, was a lie. And that thought never left him. People ask if I ever loved him. The truth, maybe once. But love doesn't survive in a house built on deception. It burns out quietly, like the last light in a room before the dark takes over. And when it does, you see everything clearly. I never wanted him dead, just gone. And in a way he is. Because now, when people speak his name, they do so in past tense. A name on an old file, a whisper in a boardroom. A man who once had everything, and then nothing. That was my victory. No blood, no spectacle, just silence. And silence, I've learned, is the purest form of revenge. When the fire dies, you expect peace. You expect silence to feel gentle, cleansing. But silence isn't peace. It's simply what remains when the noise ends. After Alexander was gone, there were days I didn't know what to do with myself. I had spent years living through purpose. Deception, precision, patience. Every morning had been a move, every word a strategy. And suddenly there was no more game to play. I remember sitting in a quiet cafe one afternoon, watching the world move on. People laughed, argued, lived, while I felt like an echo left behind. Free, yes, but hollow. I had thought revenge would feel like justice, that it would heal what was broken. But all it did was end a story, and maybe that's all it was ever meant to do. Sometimes I still think about him, not with anger, not with longing, just observation. He was a man who believed the world was a mirror of his own power, and I was the reflection that shattered it. Now I live simply. No names, no attachments, no lies. I move often. I don't leave traces. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing them. People see me and think I'm calm. They don't know that calm is just the surface of something that's already burned away. I don't regret what I did, but I no longer celebrate it either. It's simply part of me, like a scar that doesn't hurt, but never fades. If there's one truth I learned, it's this. Revenge doesn't give back what was taken. It just ensures the thief never steals again. And that, I suppose, is enough. Elizabeth Rain died the moment I chose to become her. And now that she's gone, I live, quietly, invisibly, as no one at all. Because sometimes disappearing is the only real victory.